Clusters group data elements of mixed types. A cluster is similar to a record or a struct in text-based programming languages. An example of a cluster is the LabVIEW error cluster, which combines a Boolean value, a numeric value, and a string value. Similar to arrays, a cluster is either a control or an indicator and cannot contain a mixture of controls and indicators. The difference between clusters and arrays is that a particular cluster has a fixed size, whereas a particular array can vary in size. Also, a cluster can contain mixed data types, whereas an array can only contain one data type. Let's go to LabVIEW and create a cluster control. Create a new VI. Right-click on the front panel to display the Controls palette. On the Controls palette, navigate to Modern, Array Matrix and Cluster, and drag the cluster shell onto the front panel. Resize the cluster shell so that it is big enough to contain multiple elements. On the Controls palette, navigate to Modern, Numeric, and drag and drop a numeric control inside the cluster shell. Then, navigate to Modern, String and Path, and drag and drop a string control inside the cluster shell. Finally, navigate to Modern, Boolean, and drag and drop a vertical toggle switch inside the cluster shell. The numeric, string, and Boolean controls can now be wired throughout the block diagram with one wire rather than three separate ones. Similar to array constants, cluster constants can be used to store constant data or as a basis for comparison with another cluster. On the block diagram, open the Functions palette. Navigate to Programming, Cluster Class and Variant, and drag the cluster constant shell onto the block diagram. Now navigate to the Function palette, go to Programming, Numeric, and drag and drop a numeric constant into the cluster shell. Then, go to the Functions palette. In Programming String, grab a constant string and place it in the cluster shell. Finally, go back to the Functions palette. Under Programming, Boolean, grab a true constant and place it into the cluster shell. If you already have a cluster control or indicator and want to make a cluster constant that contains the same data types as that control or indicator, simply make a copy of the cluster on the block diagram . Then, right-click on the copy and select Change to Constant.